Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Claire sat alone in the dimly lit room at the Newman Ranch, her hands trembling as she stared at the framed sonogram photo she had tucked inside her sweater. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not after everything she had survived: Jordan's manipulation, the pain of being used, the process of rebuilding who she was supposed to be. She had promised herself that if she ever moved forward, she would do it with truth, stability, and people she could trust. Yet here she was, sitting with the truth she had kept buried beneath her ribs for weeks. She was pregnant, and the father was a man whose lies had shaken her to her core. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her chest like a stone. She had tried to tell herself that it didn't matter, that the life growing inside her was innocent, blameless, untouched by the chaos that created it. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the deception, the betrayal. The moment she realized that the man she thought she could trust had been playing a dangerous game from the beginning. In the privacy of her thoughts, Claire replayed each conversation she had with him, every half-smile, every vague answer, every moment where he diverted her questions with charm rather than sincerity. She had been naive to believe him, and that realization stung more than anything else. If she couldn't trust herself to read someone correctly, how could she trust herself to become a mother? A mother deserved clarity. A mother deserved certainty. She felt as if she stood at the edge of a cliff, terrified to jump yet equally terrified to stay rooted in place. The Newman family had welcomed her, or at least tried to. Nikki had shown her compassion in ways Claire never expected, while Victoria's cautious warmth had been a balm to her lonely heart. Now Claire wondered how they would react once they learned the truth, not just about the pregnancy itself, but about who the father really was. The Newmans had endured decades of scandals, betrayals, and secret children. Would they see her as another storm heading their way, or as someone desperately trying to break free from the patterns of manipulation she was raised in? As the sun lowered outside the window, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Claire felt tears slip silently down her cheeks. She hated crying, hated feeling weak, yet she couldn't keep the storm inside her from spilling out. She pressed a hand to her stomach, shocked again by the reality that inside her existed something she hadn't expected to want, but did. She wanted this child. That was the truth that frightened her most. She wanted a chance to give someone the childhood she never had. A life without fear, without control, without lies. But to give that kind of life, she had to make decisions that weren't clouded by heartbreak or uncertainty. Could she raise this child alone? Could she bring a baby into the world knowing that the father had already betrayed her trust before the child even existed? She wasn't sure. Claire's thoughts drifted to the moment she found out the truth about him. The lies weren't small ones, they were deep, calculated, wrapped in promises that crumbled the second she tugged at the edges. She had confronted him expecting remorse, or at least an explanation, but instead she received excuses. It was as if he believed she would simply accept his justification and continue on as if nothing had happened. That reaction had shattered her. She realized then that he had never taken her heart seriously, never considered her feelings or her future. If he couldn't honor the truth when it came to her, how could she ever trust him with a child? Still, part of her felt guilty. Everyone lied at some point, didn't they? She wasn't perfect either. She had a past filled with scars and secrets she didn't always know how to reveal. Maybe expecting perfection from someone else was unrealistic. Yet this wasn't about perfection, it was about safety, stability, and the foundation she wanted for the baby. She didn't want her child growing up watching adults hurt each other with deception. She didn't want her child questioning whether their father's affection was real or a tactic. She had spent too much of her own life being treated like someone's pawn. As she sat quietly, she remembered Victoria's words from earlier that week. Victoria hadn't known what Claire was hiding, but somehow she sensed the turmoil brewing inside her. She told Claire that sometimes the biggest decisions arrive before we're ready, and that being afraid doesn't mean we're incapable. It means the choice matters. The words had struck Claire deeply. Being a Newman meant facing hard truths with strength, even if your voice shook. Claire wasn't sure if she was a real Newman in blood or spirit, but she wanted to live up to the faith Victoria had placed in her. She wanted to be strong, but strength alone couldn't erase the fear coiling inside her. Her mind wandered toward the possibility of telling the father. She tried to picture the conversation, how he would react, what he would say, whether he would even care. Would he accuse her of using the pregnancy against him? Would he claim he wanted to be involved but only to maintain appearances? Or worse, would he pretend to care while continuing to lie? The thought made her stomach churn. She imagined him holding the baby one day, promising to be present, only to break every vow when someone more interesting or more convenient entered his life. Claire had grown up with people who made promises that evaporated when she needed them most. She refused to give her child that same life. Yet a part of her wondered whether she had the right to cut him out entirely. It wasn't just her child, it was half his too, whether she liked it or not. And if she kept the pregnancy a secret, she would be making the same kind of decisions others once made for her. She didn't want to repeat those patterns. She wanted honesty even when it hurt. But honesty with him meant reopening wounds she was still trying to close. The dilemma made her feel trapped, as if no matter which path she chose, she was destined to hurt someone. Herself, him, or the baby. Time passed slowly as she considered what the Newmans would think when they found out. Nikki would worry, perhaps blame herself for not protecting Claire more. Victor would go into strategist mode, analyzing every detail, deciding whether the father was a threat. Victoria would try to comfort her, but Claire feared the disappointment she might see in her eyes. The Newmans had already endured so many broken families. Claire didn't want to be the center of yet another one. She didn't want the baby to become another Newman secret, another complication in a legacy filled with them. But she also knew that hiding the truth would only make things worse in the long run. Her tears dried slowly, leaving her emotionally exhausted but slightly clearer than before. She thought about the kind of mother she wanted to be. Patient, strong, honest, loving. She wanted to raise a child who knew their worth, who felt safe, who didn't grow up believing love came with conditions or manipulation. She wanted to break cycles, not reinforce them. To do that, she needed to make decisions rooted in what was best for the baby, not in her fear or heartbreak. She rose from the chair and walked toward the window, watching the wind move through the trees outside. The ranch had become a place of healing for her, though she still struggled to believe she belonged there. The Newmans had fought for decades over loyalty, love, betrayal, and redemption. Maybe, she thought, this was simply her turn to face a defining moment. Maybe this child, if she chose to bring them into the world, could be a chance to reshape her life, not repeat it. The thought warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. She realized then that she didn't need all the answers yet. She only needed to decide whether fear would dictate her future. As the night settled over the ranch, Claire finally allowed herself to breathe deeply. She whispered an apology to the tiny life inside her for not knowing the right path yet, but she promised she would try. She promised that she would protect this baby with everything she had, even if she had to walk through fire to do it. She knew she had a long road ahead, choices to make, truths to face, conversations she dreaded. But she also knew that strength didn't come from knowing the ending. It came from taking the first step. Claire wiped the last tear from her cheek, determined but still fragile. She would talk to the Newmans when she was ready. She would confront the father when she could do so without breaking apart. And most importantly, she would decide for herself whether this baby's future began with a new chapter, or a new lesson learned from a painful past. She didn't know yet whether she should give birth to a lying man's child, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The child deserved truth, love, and a mother willing to fight for both. And in that moment, for the first time since she discovered she was pregnant, Claire allowed herself to hope that she might be enough. The weight of the decision felt as heavy and immovable as a stone lodged in her very soul, each beat of her heart a painful thud against the unyielding reality. Claire, who had navigated the treacherous waters of Genoa City believing herself to be an orphan, a woman forged in the fires of loneliness and survival, now found the very foundation of her newfound stability cracking apart. The positive pregnancy test, once a symbol of hope and the physical manifestation of her love for Kyle, had transformed into a complex, terrifying question mark. It was no longer just about whether she was ready to be a mother, a daunting prospect in itself, but about the origin story of this nascent life. This child, a collection of rapidly dividing cells nestled within her, was conceived in a bed of lies. The man she had loved, the man whose ring she had imagined on her finger, was not the man he presented himself to be. Kyle's betrayal was not a simple indiscretion, A momentary lapse in judgment that could be forgiven with time and therapy. It was a fundamental deception, a calculated performance that made a mockery of their intimacy. Every tender word whispered in the dark, every promise of a future built together, was now cast in the sinister shadow of his duplicity. The memories that should have been her sanctuary, the mental photographs she would one day show their child. This is when your father and I were now tainted, the colors running and blurring into a picture of manipulation. How could she possibly separate the joy of the life growing inside her from the profound pain of its conception? The two were inextricably linked, a twisted double helix of love and loathing, hope and heartbreak. This was not an abstract philosophical dilemma, it was a visceral daily torment. The gentle flutter of morning sickness, a sensation shared by millions of expectant mothers, felt like a physical reminder of his deceit. The instinctual act of cradling her still flat belly was followed by a jolt of anguish, a silent scream in her mind questioning the righteousness of her protectiveness. Should she be shielding this life, a life half created by a man who so callously shattered her own? The well-meaning, albeit naive, congratulations from acquaintances were like salt in a wound she could not let them see. Each "you must be so happy" was a dagger, each "Kyle must be over the moon" a twist of that blade. How could she explain that the supposed co-author of this joy was the very source of her despair? The future played out in her mind like a tragic film reel with multiple, equally devastating endings. One version showed her raising the child alone, a constant, living reminder of the man who broke her. Every milestone, the first smile, the first step, the first word, would be bittersweet, the joy inevitably tempered by the ghost of the father's betrayal. Would she see Kyle's eyes in her child's gaze? Would his smile echo in the baby's laughter? These features, which should be a source of wonder, threatened to become daily instruments of torture, a genetic legacy she could not escape. Another, more chilling version of the future involved co-parenting. The law, and perhaps a sliver of her own morality, would dictate that Kyle had rights. The thought of being tethered to him for the next 18 years, of having to negotiate birthdays, holidays, and school meetings, of having to look into the face that lied to her with such effortless charm, was a special kind of hell. It meant the betrayal would not be a single catastrophic event she could, with time, bury in the past. It would be a chronic condition, a recurring nightmare scheduled into her calendar. Every handoff of the child at his doorstep would be a fresh humiliation, a reminder that she was forever bound to her betrayer. Could she ever truly heal, ever truly move on and build a new honest love with someone else, with the ghost of Kyle always present in the form of their shared child? The child itself would become a pawn in a silent, lifelong war, its very existence a chain linking her to a past she desperately needed to escape. The potential for conflict was infinite, from disagreements over parenting styles to the inevitable moment when the child would ask why mommy and daddy don't live together. What story would she tell? A sanitized version that protected the child but felt like a betrayal of her own truth? Or the painful reality that risked coloring the child's perception of its own father, and by extension itself? And then there was the most terrifying question of all, one that whispered in the deepest, darkest hours of the night when sleep was a forgotten luxury. What if the capacity for such profound deception was not merely a flaw in character, but something deeper, something hereditary? It was an irrational fear, perhaps, the kind that grips even the most logical minds in moments of extreme trauma, but it was potent nonetheless. Could a man who lied so completely, who built a relationship on a foundation of sand, pass on a predisposition for that same duplicity? Was there a lying gene that she was unknowingly inviting into the next generation? She knew intellectually that personality is a complex interplay of genetics and environment, but the fear was a visceral one. The idea that her child could inherit not just Kyle's eyes or his smile, but his core moral failing, was a burden almost too heavy to contemplate. It added a layer of cosmic responsibility to her decision. She wasn't just deciding for herself and her own heart. She was potentially deciding for the future hearts that her child would one day hold and break. This line of thinking led her down a path of profound isolation. Who could she possibly talk to about this? The people in her life would fall into predictable camps. Some would champion the sanctity of the unborn child above all else, dismissing her pain as secondary to the miracle of life. Others, more pragmatic, would urge her to prioritize her own mental health and future happiness, seeing the pregnancy as an anchor tying her to a sinking ship. But no one could truly understand the specific, unique agony of carrying the child of a man you now revile. It was a solitary confinement of the spirit. Amidst this maelstrom of doubt and fear, a small stubborn ember of something else began to glow, a fierce, primal, and surprisingly clear sense of ownership. This was her body. Regardless of how the pregnancy began, the reality of it was happening within her. The nausea, the fatigue, the surreal awareness of a life taking shape. These were her experiences, not Kyle's. He had forfeited any right to the intimacy of this process the moment his lie was revealed. This child, regardless of its paternal origins, was also a part of her. It was made from her DNA, her resilience, her history. It would be nourished by her blood, her body. In a world where Kyle had stolen her agency, where he had manipulated her reality, this pregnancy, paradoxically, became the one thing over which she had ultimate sovereignty. The decision, in all its terrifying complexity, was hers and hers alone. To continue the pregnancy would be a choice she made for herself, a declaration that she was strong enough to love a child born of pain, to transform that pain into purpose. It would be a testament to her own capacity for love, a love so powerful it could transcend the circumstances of its origin. The child would not be Kyle's child. It would be her child, who she would raise with the integrity, honesty, and fierce loyalty that he so profoundly lacked. She could rewrite the narrative. The story would no longer be Claire's tears, the lying man's child, but Claire's strength. How I raised a wonderful child in spite of his father. Conversely, to terminate the pregnancy would not be an act of weakness or surrender, but another profound exercise of that same sovereignty. It would be the ultimate act of self-preservation, a decisive cutting of the chain that bound her to Kyle. It would be a painful, heartbreaking choice, but one made with the clear-eyed understanding that some wounds are too deep, some betrayals too absolute, to be forever memorialized in a living, breathing human being. It would be a choice to grant herself the freedom to heal completely, to one day build a family on a foundation of truth, not treachery. It would be prioritizing her own shattered spirit, acknowledging that she could not pour from an empty cup, and that the bitterness and resentment she felt posed a real risk to both her and a potential child. There was no morally pristine path, no decision that would wipe the slate clean and return her to the woman she was before she saw the positive test, before she learned the devastating truth. Both paths were fraught with pain and sacrifice. One path offered the profound, complicated joy of motherhood intertwined with a lifetime of painful reminders. The other offered the bleak freedom of a clean break, haunted by the ghost of what might have been. As she sat alone, the silence of her apartment pressing in on her, she placed a hand on her stomach, a gesture that was now more question than comfort. The answer would not come from outside voices, from societal expectations, or from a desire for revenge. It would have to come from the deepest, most honest part of herself. It was a choice between two different kinds of courage. The courage to embrace a complicated future built on the ashes of betrayal, or the courage to let go of a potential life in order to save her own. For Claire, in the quiet eye of her personal hurricane, the tears continued to fall, each one containing the reflection of an impossible choice.